The smell of charcoal and barbecue sauce hung thick in the August air, but it couldn't mask the tension brewing in my parents' backyard. The same picnic tables we'd used for 20 years were arranged in perfect rows, red checkered tablecloths, weighing down against the evening breeze. Extended family clustered around the grill, their laughter echoing across the manicured lawn of our suburban Denver home. My name is Maya Rodriguez, and to everyone gathered here, I was still the family disappointment who'd thrown away a perfectly good accounting degree to chase impossible dreams in Los Angeles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat at the far corner table, nursing a lukewarm Coke and watching my relatives dissect my life choices with the same enthusiasm they reserved for my uncle's famous ribs. At 29, I was the cautionary tale they whispered about at family gatherings. The one who'd left a stable job at a prestigious firm to pursue something they couldn't understand. Something they'd never stopped calling a waste of time. My mother, Elena, bustled between the kitchen and the patio, her face wearing that particular expression of controlled embarrassment she'd perfected over the past 5 years. Every few minutes, she'd glance in my direction with a mixture of love and disappointment that cut deeper than any words ever could. My father, Carlos, stood by the grill with his brothers, their conversation punctuated by occasional glances toward my lonely corner. I knew they were discussing me again, wondering when their eldest daughter would finally come to her senses and return to the safe, predictable path they'd mapped out for her. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting here, supposedly broke and directionless, while wearing a custom Hermes blazer that cost more than most people's monthly salary. But appearances were everything in the Rodriguez family, and mine had been carefully crafted to maintain the illusion they all needed to believe. The modest rental car parked on the street, the simple jewelry, the understated makeup, all of it designed to keep them comfortable in their assumptions about my failure. My sister Carmen arrived fashionably late, as always, her red convertible purring into the driveway like a well-fed cat. She emerged in a cloud of expensive perfume and confidence, her real estate license having recently earned her a spot as the family's new golden child. At 26, she'd already closed several six-figure deals in Boulder's booming market, and our parents couldn't stop bragging about her success to anyone who'd listen. "Maya!" she called out, her voice carrying that particular blend of affection and pity that had become her trademark when addressing me. "Still hiding in the corner, I see. You know, there's actually a really good accounting firm in Denver that's hiring. I could put in a word for you." The gathered relatives turned their attention to us, sensing drama in the way families always do. Aunt Rosa raised an eyebrow, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Uncle Miguel set down his beer and leaned forward, clearly anticipating another episode in the ongoing saga of Maya's failures. My cousin Sophia, fresh out of Colorado State with her business degree, watched with the kind of fascination reserved for car crashes and reality TV. "Thanks, Carmen, but I'm good," I replied evenly, taking another sip of my Coke. The condensation on the can was cold against my fingers, a small anchor in the storm of expectations swirling around me. Carmen settled into the chair across from me, her movements graceful and deliberate. She'd always been the family star, the one who did everything right, who followed the prescribed path from good grades to good college to good career. "Maya, I know you think you're pursuing your dreams or whatever, but reality has to set in eventually. Mom and Dad are worried sick about you." "Your sister's right," Dad called out from the grill, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Maya, you've been playing around in California for 5 years now. When are you going to get serious about your life?" The conversation at the other tables died down as our family drama took center stage. This was familiar territory, Maya's life choices as the evening's entertainment. I'd become accustomed to being the spectacle, the topic that united everyone else in their shared concern and disapproval. Mom appeared at our table with a plate of food I hadn't asked for, her expression soft but determined. Mija, we've been patient. We've supported your exploration, but you're almost 30. Don't you want stability, security, a family of your own? I have stability, Mom, I said quietly, but my words were lost in the chorus of well-meaning advice that erupted from every direction. Maya, you're wasting your education, chimed in my Uncle Roberto, who'd driven down from Fort Collins specifically for this gathering. You were always so good with numbers. Why throw that away for something so uncertain? Aunt Teresa nodded vigorously from her spot at the next table. My friend's daughter went through the same phase. Thought she was going to be an artist or something. Now she's happily married with 2 kids and works at a bank. Sometimes we have to grow up and accept reality. The weight of their collective disappointment settled over me like a heavy blanket. These were people who loved me, who genuinely believed they were helping by trying to steer me back toward what they considered a sensible life. They couldn't see past their own limited understanding of success, couldn't imagine that the path they'd rejected might actually lead somewhere extraordinary. Carmen leaned forward, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a caring whisper, but was loud enough for half the party to hear. Maya, I've been talking to Mom and Dad. We think maybe it's time for an intervention. You can't keep pretending that whatever you're doing in LA is working. You don't even have health insurance, do you? Actually, I had the best health insurance money could buy, along with dental, vision, and a concierge medical service that most celebrities would envy. But explaining that would require explanations I wasn't ready to give, secrets I'd kept carefully, guarded for reasons that were about to become crystal clear. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Look, I said, setting down my Coke and meeting Carmen's eyes directly. I appreciate everyone's concern, but I'm doing fine. Better than fine, actually. A ripple of skeptical laughter moved through the gathered family. Uncle Miguel shook his head with the kind of sad amusement reserved for delusional relatives. Maya, sweetie, fine doesn't mean living paycheck to paycheck and couch surfing in Hollywood. The assumption stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how little faith they had in my judgment and capabilities. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my life based on their fears and limited imagination, never bothering to ask if their assumptions matched reality. You know what I think? Sophia piped up from her spot near the dessert table. Maya's too proud to admit she made a mistake. It's like when people stay in bad relationships just because they don't want to admit they were wrong. The comparison hit harder than it should have. Not because there was any truth to it, but because it perfectly illustrated how my family viewed my life. As a mistake to be corrected, rather than a choice to be respected. Dad turned off the grill and walked over to our table, his expression serious. Maya, we need to have a real conversation about your future. You can't keep drifting forever. I'm not drifting, I protested, but the words felt weak against the wall of certainty they'd built around their perceptions of my life. Then what exactly are you doing? Carmen challenged, her real estate agent instincts kicking in. What's your 5-year plan? Your retirement strategy? Do you even have a business plan for whatever it is you think you're building? The questions hung in the air like smoke from the grill, and I realized we'd reached the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment when their concern would cross the line into something uglier, when their love would curdle into frustration and ultimatums. Mom sat down beside Carmen, creating a united front that felt more like an ambush than a family conversation. Mija, we've been enabling this fantasy long enough. It's time to come home, get a real job, and start building a real life. This is my real life, I said. But even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow without context they weren't ready to hear. A real life involves responsibility, Dad said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used when I was a teenager. Caught breaking curfew. It involves contributing to society, building something lasting, not chasing pipe dreams that lead nowhere. The gathered family nodded their agreement, a chorus of heads bobbing in unison like dashboard ornaments. They meant well, I reminded myself. They were trying to save me from what they perceived as a life of poverty and delusion. They couldn't see the irony in their concern, couldn't understand that the very qualities they criticized, my willingness to take risks, my refusal to accept conventional limitations, my determination to build something unique, were exactly what had led to success beyond anything they could imagine. Uncle Roberto cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what was clearly meant to be the final word on the subject. Maya, success isn't about following your dreams. It's about making practical choices that provide security and stability. Dreams are for children. The statement landed like a physical blow, not because I believed it, but because it represented everything I'd been fighting against for the past 5 years. The idea that ambition should be tempered by fear, that innovation should be sacrificed for security, that the only worthwhile dreams were the ones that fit neatly into predetermined boxes. Carmen reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and slightly condescending. "We're not trying to hurt you, Maya. We're trying to help you see that it's okay to admit when something isn't working. There's no shame in changing course." But there was shame in their eyes, shame in the way they looked at me, shame in the carefully constructed intervention they'd disguised as a family barbecue. They were ashamed of my choices, ashamed of their inability to explain my life to their friends and colleagues, ashamed of the daughter who'd colored outside the lines they'd drawn so carefully. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and I realized that the moment of truth was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the evening with messages I'd been ignoring, calls from my assistant about deals closing, and opportunities arising in a world these people couldn't even imagine. "You know what your problem is, Maya," Carmen continued, apparently interpreting my silence as surrender. "You're too stubborn to admit when you're wrong. Pride is going to be your downfall." The prediction hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something shift inside me. The careful control I'd maintained all evening began to crack, not from anger, but from a sudden crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. They'd made their position clear. They'd drawn their lines and chosen their sides. Now it was my turn. The evening air grew heavier as more family members joined what was clearly becoming a coordinated effort to save me from myself. My cousin Daniel, who worked as a manager at a local insurance company, pulled up a chair with the confidence of someone about to deliver life-changing wisdom. "Maya, I've been watching this whole situation, and I think I understand what's happening. Here," he announced, adjusting his polo shirt with the kind of self-importance that made my skin crawl. "You're suffering from what they call sunk cost fallacy. You've invested so much time in this California thing that you can't admit it's not working." Aunt Maria nodded sagely from her position near the potato salad. "Daniel's right. Sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is cut your losses and start over. There's no shame in admitting a mistake." But there was shame radiating from every sideways glance, every whispered conversation that stopped when I approached, every carefully worded question about my situation in Los Angeles. They'd transformed my life into a cautionary tale, a story. They told themselves about the dangers of straying from the approved path. Carmen squeezed my hand tighter, her nails digging slightly into my palm. "Maya, we found out about the credit cards. Mom told me you've been maxing them out just to survive. This has to stop." The credit cards. Of course they'd discovered those. What they didn't know was that those same cards were business expenses, client dinners at restaurants they'd never heard of, travel to meetings in cities they'd never visit, equipment purchases for projects they couldn't comprehend. The financial picture they'd constructed from fragments of truth was as far from reality as their understanding of my actual life. "We're staging an intervention because we love you," Mom said, her voice breaking slightly on the word love. We can't watch you destroy your future anymore. Uncle Roberto stood up, clearly preparing to deliver what he considered the knockout punch. Maya, your cousin Jessica just bought her second house. She's 27 and already has the investment portfolio. That's what success looks like in the real world. Jessica, who worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, beamed from her spot at the dessert table. She'd always been held up as the model of responsible adulting, with her company car and her 401k and her predictable trajectory towards suburban contentment. I'd be happy to help you put together a resume, Jessica offered, her voice dripping with the kind of charity that felt more like pity. I know people in corporate accounting. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be stable. The word stable seemed to be their favorite ammunition tonight. Stable job, stable income, stable future. All things they were convinced I lacked. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter as the smoke from Dad's overcharred burgers. Carmen released my hand and leaned back in her chair, switching tactics with the skill of someone accustomed to closing difficult deals. Maya, let's talk numbers. What's your monthly income? Your savings account balance? Your retirement contributions? The questions were designed to humiliate, to force me to admit to financial instability that would justify their intervention. They wanted me broke and desperate so they could swoop in with their solutions and their superior judgment. I do okay, I said quietly, but the response only fueled their determination to crack my defenses. Okay isn't good enough anymore, Dad interjected, abandoning the grill entirely to join the circle of concerned relatives. You're almost 30, Maya. Your biological clock is ticking. When are you going to settle down and start a family? The biological clock argument, their ultimate weapon, because in their minds, a woman's worth was ultimately measured by her ability to reproduce within socially acceptable timeframes and financial circumstances. My success or failure as a human being was tied directly to my uterus and my willingness to use it according to their schedule. Carlos is right, Aunt Teresa added, nodding vigorously. My neighbor's daughter waited too long to get serious about life. Now she's 35, single, and struggling to find anyone willing to take on her baggage. Baggage. As if my dreams and ambitions were burdens to be overcome rather than assets to be celebrated. As if my refusal to conform was a character flaw that made me unmarketable in the relationship economy they understood. Sophia, emboldened by the adult's increasingly aggressive tone, decided to pile on with the cruelty that only family members can inflict. Maya, everyone talks about you behind your back. They call you the family failure. Don't you care about our reputation? The words hit like a physical slap, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. I wasn't just disappointing them, I was embarrassing them. My choices reflected poorly on their parenting, their values, their entire worldview. That's enough, Mom said sharply, but the damage was done. The truth had been spoken aloud. I was their shame, their cautionary tale, their proof that sometimes love wasn't enough to guide a child toward the right choices. Carmen shot Sophia a warning look before turning back to me with renewed determination. What Sophia means is that we worry about how your choices affect your future opportunities. Reputation matters in the professional world. But reputation was exactly what they were destroying with their public dissection of my life. Every family gathering became another opportunity to analyze my failures, another chance for them to demonstrate their superior wisdom and my obvious delusions. You know what I think? Uncle Miguel said, setting down his beer with the authority of someone about to deliver absolute truth. Maya's addicted to chaos. Some people get comfortable with instability because it feels dramatic and important. But drama isn't success. The psychology lesson stung because it revealed how little they understood about calculated risk versus reckless behavior. They couldn't distinguish between chaos and controlled disruption, between failure and strategic patience. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased to have his insurance industry wisdom validated by an elder. It's like people who stay in toxic relationships because they mistake intensity for passion. Maya's confused struggle with achievement. Their analysis of my psychological state was as accurate as their assessment of my financial situation, but their confidence in their diagnoses was absolute. They'd decided I was delusional, self-destructive, and possibly mentally unstable. Anything rather than admit they might not understand the full picture. "I think," Carmen said slowly, her real estate training evident in her careful word choice, "that Maya needs professional help. Maybe therapy to work through whatever's keeping her stuck in this pattern." Therapy. The ultimate admission of defeat in their minds, the final proof that I couldn't handle life without professional intervention. They wanted me medicated into compliance, counseled into conformity. "That's not a bad idea," Mom said thoughtfully, and I could see her mentally calculating the cost of psychiatric treatment versus the ongoing embarrassment of my continued independence. Dad crossed his arms, assuming the position he'd held during every serious conversation of my childhood. "Maya, we're giving you a choice. You can come home, get help, and start rebuilding your life the right way. Or you can continue down this path alone." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from the dying barbecue. Choose their version of sanity or lose their support entirely. Conform or be cast out. Accept their judgment or forfeit their love. Uncle Roberto nodded approvingly. Sometimes tough love is the only answer. We can't enable self-destructive behavior indefinitely. But what they called self-destructive behavior, I called calculated investment in a future they couldn't envision. What they saw as instability, I recognized as the inevitable turbulence that accompanies significant growth. "Maya," Aunt Maria said gently, apparently designated as the voice of maternal concern, "we've all made sacrifices for family. That's what adults do. We put aside our fantasies and focus on reality." Sacrifices. As if dreams were luxuries to be abandoned rather than goals to be pursued. As if settling for less was a virtue rather than a tragedy. Carmen leaned forward again, her voice taking on the closing argument tone she used with difficult clients. "Maya, I'm going to be blunt. You're embarrassing yourself in this family. It's time to grow up." The accusation of immaturity was their nuclear option, the suggestion that my choices stemmed from an inability to accept adult responsibility, rather than a commitment to creating something extraordinary. "Everyone here has offered to help you," Dad continued, gesturing toward the assembled relatives. "Jobs, connections, advice, everything you need to get back on track. What more do you want from us?" What I wanted was belief in my capabilities, respect for my judgment, and trust in my vision. What I wanted was a family that celebrated my courage rather than mourning my choices. What I wanted was impossible, given their fundamental inability to see past their own limitations. "You're being selfish," Sophia added, her young voice cutting through the evening air with surgical precision. "Mom and Dad have sacrificed everything for us, and you're throwing it back in their faces." Selfish. The accusation that had haunted every major decision I'd made since leaving accounting. Selfish to pursue my own dreams. Selfish to reject their plans for my life. Selfish to believe I deserved more than they thought I could achieve. The barbecue that had started as a family celebration had transformed into a tribunal, with me as the defendant facing charges of irresponsibility, delusion, and ingratitude. The smell of charcoal and disappointment hung heavy in the cooling air. "Maya," Mom said finally, her voice carrying the weight of years of worry and frustration. "We can't keep pretending everything is fine. You're a failure, mija. You're a beautiful, intelligent failure, and we don't know how to help you anymore." The word hung between us like a blade. Failure, failure, failure. It echoed in the sudden silence that followed, bouncing off the Picnic tables and settling into the grass like spilled barbecue sauce that would stain everything it touched. Failure. After everything I'd built, everything I'd achieved, everything I'd overcome, I was still, in their eyes, nothing more than a beautiful, intelligent failure. My phone buzzed again, insistent and urgent, but I ignored it. The timing felt almost cosmic, as if the universe was preparing to deliver the punchline to a joke only I understood. But the joke was about to be on them. The word failure still hung in the air when my phone rang with the unmistakable ringtone I'd assigned to my executive assistant. The sound cut through the evening silence like a knife, drawing annoyed glances from my family members who clearly felt I was being disrespectful during their carefully orchestrated intervention. "Maya, seriously?" Carmen snapped. "We're trying to have an important conversation here. Can't whatever dead-end job you're working wait until tomorrow?" I glanced at the caller ID and felt a familiar surge of anticipation. Sarah Chen, my assistant, never called during family time unless something extraordinary was happening. The timing was almost too perfect, as if the universe had decided this was the exact moment my two worlds needed to collide. "I should take this," I said quietly, standing up from the picnic table. "Absolutely not," Dad interjected, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded throughout my childhood. "You're not walking away from this conversation to answer some telemarketing call." Uncle Roberto laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the evening air. "Let me guess. Another opportunity from one of your Hollywood friends? Maya, we're trying to save you from these scams." The assumption that any call I received must be fraudulent or worthless perfectly encapsulated their understanding of my life. In their minds, successful people didn't call Maya Rodriguez. Important opportunities didn't knock on my door. I was too much of a failure to warrant legitimate business communications. "It's not a scam," I said, but my words were lost in the chorus of dismissive laughter that erupted from the gathered family. Carmen stood up and moved to block my path toward the house. "Maya, you're not running away from this. We've all taken time out of our busy schedules to help you. The least you can do is show some respect." My phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Sarah's persistence meant only one thing. The deal we'd been negotiating for months had finally closed. The acquisition that would fundamentally change everything, not just for my company, but for the entire industry we'd been quietly revolutionizing. "Whoever it is can wait," Mom said firmly, her maternal authority joining forces with Dad's paternal command. "Family comes first, mija. That's something you seem to have forgotten." But my phone was buzzing with a text message now, and I could see the beginning of Sarah's message on the lock screen. "Urgent. Netflix deal closed at 8:47. Press conference tomorrow. Need immediate." The rest was cut off, but I'd seen enough. $847 million. The streaming platform acquisition that had been in negotiation since January had finally been finalized, officially making my production company one of the most valuable entertainment entities in North America. "Answer the phone if it's so important," Sophia challenged, her young voice sharp with the kind of cruelty that only comes from complete ignorance. "Let us all hear about your latest big break that's going to make you famous." The mockery in her tone was unmistakable, and I could see the anticipation in their faces. They wanted me to answer the call so they could witness firsthand the kind of pathetic conversation they imagined I had with my Hollywood contacts. They were expecting to hear me beg for small roles or plead for unpaid internships. "You know what?" I said, my finger hovering over the answer button. "You're absolutely right. Let's put this on speaker so everyone can hear." The suggestion seemed to catch them off guard, but their curiosity was stronger than their caution. They'd been building toward this moment all evening, the public humiliation that would finally convince me to abandon my delusions and accept their version of reality. Carmen gestured toward the picnic table with theatrical magnanimity. "By all means, let's hear from your important business contact." I answered the call and immediately switched to speaker mode, setting the phone in the center of the table where everyone could hear clearly. Sarah's voice came through crystal clear, her excited energy immediately apparent to everyone listening. "Maya, thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. The Netflix deal just closed." The table fell silent. I could see my family members exchanging confused glances, trying to process what they'd just heard. Netflix deal? Their expressions suggested they were waiting for the punchline, the moment when this would reveal itself as an elaborate prank. "Sarah, I'm actually with family right now," I said calmly, enjoying the growing bewilderment on their faces. "Can you give me the highlights?" Of course. The final number came in at $847 million for the acquisition. Phoenix Entertainment is now officially a subsidiary of Netflix, but you retain full creative control as CEO. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Variety wants an exclusive interview. Uncle Miguel dropped his beer bottle, the glass shattering against the concrete patio with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Aunt Maria's mouth had fallen open so wide I could see her dental work. Carmen was staring at the phone like it might explode. "Additionally," Sarah continued, her professional enthusiasm undimmed by the stunned silence on my end, "the International Film Festival just confirmed your keynote speech for next month, and Forbes wants to update your profile for their Self-Made Women issue." Forbes. Self-made women. The words hung in the air like foreign concepts my family couldn't quite translate. These were publications they recognized, institutions they respected, entities that didn't waste time on failures or delusional dreamers. Dad had gone completely pale, his hand gripping the edge of the picnic table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Mom was staring at me like I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. The woman they'd just called a beautiful, intelligent failure was apparently newsworthy enough for one of the most prestigious business magazines in the world. "Sarah," I said, maintaining the calm tone that had become second nature during high stakes. "Negotiations? What's the timeline for the integration meetings?" "Next week in Los Angeles. The Netflix executives want to discuss the expansion strategy for Phoenix's international markets. Also, the documentary about your company's growth is premiering at Sundance, and they need final approval on the edit." Sundance. The word hit my family like a physical blow. Even Sophia, who'd been so quick with her cruel observations, had gone completely silent. They knew Sundance. They understood what it meant for a documentary about my work to premiere at one of the most prestigious film festivals in the world. Carmen finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Maya, what is Phoenix? Entertainment?" I looked around the table at their stunned faces, seeing my family clearly for perhaps the first time in years. They weren't evil people. They weren't intentionally cruel. They were simply limited by their own experiences, trapped within the boundaries of what they thought was possible. "Phoenix Entertainment," I said quietly, "is the production company I founded 3 years ago. We specialize in developing streaming, content for global audiences, with a focus on underrepresented voices and emerging markets. The production company that just sold for $847 million, Sarah added helpfully from the phone speaker, her voice cutting through their shocked silence like a blade through silk. Uncle Roberto was the first to recover, though his voice shook as he spoke. "Maya, are you saying you own a production company worth nearly $1 billion? "Owned," I corrected gently. "As of today, I own 65% of a Netflix subsidiary worth considerably more than that, with guaranteed creative control and a development budget that most studio heads would kill for." The numbers were too large for immediate comprehension. I could see them trying to do the mental math, trying to understand what 65% of $847 million actually meant in practical terms. Daniel, who'd been so confident about my sunk cost fallacy, was now questioning everything he thought he knew about business and success. His insurance industry wisdom suddenly seemed painfully inadequate for analyzing the situation unfolding before him. Maya, Sarah's voice continued from the speaker, I hate to interrupt, but the Wall Street Journal is holding for comment on the acquisition announcement. Should I tell them you'll call back? Wall Street Journal, another institution my family, recognized and respected, another validation that this wasn't some elaborate fantasy or carefully constructed delusion. Tell them I'll call in 30 minutes, I replied, then looked directly at Carmen. I need to finish a conversation with my family first. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background noise of the neighborhood seemed to have stopped, as if the entire world was waiting to see how my family would process this revelation. Mom was the first to speak, her voice small and confused. Mija, I don't understand. If you have all this success, why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized that this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I'd left Denver 5 years ago. The moment when I'd have to explain not just what I'd built, but why I'd chosen to build it in secret. Because, I said quietly, looking around the table at each of their faces, every time I tried to share my dreams with you, you called them impossible. Every time I explained my vision, you told me to be realistic. Every time I asked for support, you offered me a backup plan. Carmen shook her head, her real estate agent instincts kicking in as she tried to process the financial implications. But Maya, we could have helped. We could have invested, supported you, celebrated your success. Could you? I asked, my voice gentle but firm. Tonight, before this phone call, you called me a failure. You staged an intervention to save me from my delusions. You offered me therapy to cure my inability to accept reality. The truth of my words was undeniable, written in their guilty expressions and uncomfortable silence. They had called me a failure. They had questioned my sanity. They had assumed the worst about every aspect of my life without ever asking if their assumptions were accurate. Maya, Dad said slowly, his voice heavy with dawning realization. How long have you been successful? It was such a loaded question, revealing so much about how they measured worth and achievement. When did failure transform into success? At what dollar amount did their disappointment become pride? Define successful, I replied, pulling my phone closer as Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker. Maya, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but Oprah's production team just called. They want to discuss featuring your story on her next special about entrepreneurial women who've overcome family adversity. Oprah. The name hit my family like a thunderbolt, because if there was one person they all universally respected and admired, it was Oprah Winfrey. The idea that she wanted to feature my story was beyond their ability to dismiss or minimize. Aunt Teresa was crying now, though whether from shock, regret, or pride was impossible to determine. Uncle Miguel had sat down heavily in his chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Sarah, I said into the phone, I'll need to call you back. Family emergency. Of course, but Maya, congratulations. You've built something extraordinary, and the whole industry is taking notice. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, then looked around the table at my family's stunned faces. The barbecue that had started as their intervention had become my revelation. Their attempt to humble me had become my vindication. So, I said quietly, I guess we need to have a different conversation now. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Carmen finally broke it, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya, I need to understand. You've been sitting here letting us call you a failure when you're worth. How much exactly? I leaned back in my chair, studying the faces around me. Faces that had transformed from smugness to shock, to something approaching awe in the span of a single phone call. The exact number isn't really important, Carmen. What matters is that you all made assumptions about my life without ever asking for the truth. Dad stood up abruptly, beginning to pace the length of the patio with the restless energy of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. Maya, this doesn't make sense. If you're this successful, why are you driving that old rental car? Why do you dress so modestly? The question revealed everything about how they measured success. By external displays of wealth, by status symbols that announced your achievements to the world. They couldn't comprehend that I might have reasons for maintaining a low profile, strategic purposes for appearing less successful than I actually was. Because, I said, watching his agitated pacing, I learned early on that people treat you differently when they know what you're worth. I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, understanding dawning in her eyes. Dios mío, Maya, we've been treating you like a charity case. Worse than that, I replied gently. You've been treating me like a disappointment, like someone whose dreams were inherently worthless because they didn't match your definition of success. Uncle Roberto, who'd been silent since the phone call ended, suddenly slammed his hand on the table. This is impossible. Production companies don't just appear overnight. You can't build something worth hundreds of millions of dollars in secret. His outburst revealed the depth of his disbelief, his inability to reconcile the Maya he thought he knew with the reality that had just been revealed. It was easier for him to assume this was all an elaborate hoax than to admit he'd been completely wrong about my capabilities. You're right, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the Phoenix Entertainment website. Companies like this don't appear overnight. They're built through years of careful planning, strategic partnerships, and calculated risks. I turned the screen toward them, showing them the sleek website with its impressive client roster, award-winning productions, and executive team photos that included my own professional headshot as founder and CEO. Sophia, who'd been so cruel with her comments about family reputation, was now scrolling frantically through her own phone. Maya, you're trending on Twitter. There are articles about the Netflix deal everywhere. The real-time validation was perhaps more powerful than any explanation I could offer. Their phones were buzzing with news alerts about an acquisition involving someone they'd been calling a failure just minutes before. Forbes has you listed as one of the top 50 most influential women in entertainment, Daniel read from his screen, his voice hollow with disbelief. Forbes. Maya. Forbes has been tracking your success for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who'd dismissed my dreams were now frantically Googling my achievements, trying to understand how they'd missed something so significant happening right under their noses. Carmen was studying her phone with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. Maya, according to this article in Variety, you've been developing content for Netflix for over 2 years. The deal they announced today is just the culmination of an existing partnership. That's correct, I confirmed. Phoenix Entertainment has been one of Netflix's most successful content partners. Today's acquisition was the natural next step in a relationship we've been building since the company's inception. Aunt Maria, who'd been silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke up. Maya, why didn't you ever tell us? We're your family. We should have known. The question struck at the heart of everything that had gone wrong between us. They wanted to know why I'd excluded them from my success, but they couldn't see how they'd excluded themselves through their own assumptions and judgments. I tried to tell you, I said, my voice carrying years of accumulated frustration. Every time I came home, I tried to share what I was building. But you weren't interested in my dreams. You were only interested in fixing what you perceived as my problems. The truth of my words was written in their guilty expressions. They remembered the conversations where they'd interrupted my explanations to offer career advice. They recalled the family dinners where they'd change the subject whenever I mentioned my work in Los Angeles. But this changes everything, Uncle Miguel said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, something approaching respect. Maya, you're not just successful. You're extraordinarily successful. You're more successful than any of us. The comparison seemed to be causing him physical pain, as if admitting my achievements somehow diminished his own. In his mind, success was a zero-sum game where my victory necessitated his defeat. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from my lawyer. I glanced at the screen and saw a text message preview. Congratulations on the Netflix deal. Disney wants to schedule a meeting about potential partnership. Time sensitive. Disney. Even my family recognized that name, understood what it meant for one of the world's largest entertainment companies to be actively pursuing my business. Maya, Dad said, stopping his pacing to face me directly. I need you to help me understand something. If you've been this successful all along, why did you let us worry about you? Why did you let us think you were struggling? The question revealed the depth of his confusion, his inability to understand that my success didn't obligate me to manage their emotions or protect them from their own assumptions. I didn't let you think anything, I replied. You chose to think I was struggling because that narrative was more comfortable for you than admitting you might be wrong about my choices. Carmen set down her phone and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been admiration mixed with fear. Maya, the articles I'm reading, they're calling you a visionary. They're comparing you to industry leaders who've revolutionized entertainment. The recognition from legitimate media sources was perhaps more convincing than any personal testimony I could offer. These weren't family members trying to be supportive. These were industry professionals acknowledging achievements they could measure and verify. There's something else, I said, deciding it was time for complete transparency. The house you think I'm renting in LA? I own it, along with 2 others. And the struggling artist lifestyle you've been worried about? My personal assistant makes more than most of your annual salaries. The financial details seemed to hit them like physical blows. They'd been so convinced of my poverty that evidence of my wealth was almost impossible to process. Sophia, who'd been the cruelest with her comments about family reputation, was now reading something on her phone that was clearly distressing her. Maya, there's an interview you did with The Hollywood Reporter where you talk about overcoming family skepticism to build an entertainment empire. Were you talking about us? The article she'd found was from 6 months ago, part of a profile piece about rising executives in the entertainment industry. In it, I'd spoken candidly about the challenges of pursuing unconventional dreams without family support. I was talking about the universal challenge of believing in yourself when the people closest to you can't see your vision, I said carefully. It wasn't specifically about this family, but about the broader experience of choosing an uncertain path toward extraordinary goals. But they all recognized themselves in the description, saw their own words and attitudes reflected in my carefully diplomatic language about family skepticism. Uncle Roberto was shaking his head slowly, as if trying to wake up from a confusing dream. Maya, do you realize what this means? You're not just successful, you're famous. You're a celebrity. The word celebrity seemed to carry special weight for him, representing a level of achievement that transcended mere financial success. In his mind, fame was the ultimate validation, proof that success wasn't just real, but publicly acknowledged. I'm not a celebrity, I corrected gently. I'm a businesswoman who's been recognized for her work in an industry that gets a lot of media attention. But the distinction was lost on them. They were still processing the basic reality that their failure of a daughter was being featured in major publications and pursued by industry giants. My phone rang again, and I could see it was Sarah calling back. I answered quickly, knowing she wouldn't interrupt again unless it was truly urgent. Maya, I'm sorry, but this can't wait. Netflix wants to announce the promotion of Phoenix Entertainment's development slate at tomorrow's press conference. We're talking about a 24-project pipeline over the next 3 years. 24 projects. The number seemed to echo across the patio, and I could see my family trying to calculate what that might mean in terms of budget, scope, and industry influence. Also, Sarah continued, your sister has been calling the office trying to reach you. She says it's urgent family business? I looked across the table at Carmen, who was staring at me with an expression of dawning horror. She'd been calling my office. My sister, who'd spent the evening lecturing me about getting a real job, had been trying to reach me through the corporate number of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sarah, my sister is sitting right here with me. Was there something specific she needed? She wanted to know if Phoenix Entertainment was hiring. She said she was calling on behalf of a family member who needed career guidance. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Carmen had been calling my company to ask for job opportunities, not knowing she was trying to get her failure sister to hire her. I can take that conversation offline, I said, ending the call and looking directly at Carmen. So you wanted to know if my company was hiring? Carmen's face had gone completely white. Maya, I didn't know. I researched the company name you mentioned and it seemed legitimate, so I thought maybe you knew someone there who could. Who could what? I asked gently. Give the family failure a pity job? The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what she'd been thinking. Even after researching Phoenix Entertainment, even after seeing its success and reputation, she'd assumed I was connected to it as an employee rather than its founder. I wanted to help you, she said weakly, but we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Carmen had been looking for opportunities for herself, ways to leverage what she thought was my connection to a successful company. Dad sat down heavily in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Maya, I don't know what to say. We've made terrible mistakes. You made assumptions, I corrected. And when those assumptions were challenged, you doubled down instead of asking questions. The distinction was important because assumptions could be corrected with information, but their resistance to new information had been the real barrier between us. Aunt Teresa, who'd been quietly crying throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. Maya, can you ever forgive us? We've been so wrong about everything. The question of forgiveness was complex because it implied that their behavior had been intentionally hurtful rather than simply ignorant. They hadn't set out to wound me. They genuinely believed they were helping. There's nothing to forgive, I said quietly. But there's a lot to understand. You've spent years trying to save me from a life you thought was failing, when what I needed was support for a vision you couldn't see. The evening air had grown cooler, and the abandoned barbecue seemed like a relic from another era, back when their biggest concern was my inability to maintain steady employment. Maya, Carmen said, her voice small and uncertain. What happens now? How do we move forward from this? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. They wanted to know if there was a place for them in my success, if they could somehow become part of the story they'd spent years trying to rewrite. Now, I said, standing up from the picnic table, you get to decide who you want to be, the family that celebrates success only after it's undeniable, or the family that believes in dreams even when they seem impossible. The choice I was offering them was both simple and profound. They could continue to be the people who'd called me a failure, or they could become the people who learned to see potential before it became obvious. Because in the end, success wasn't just about what I'd built. It was about whether the people I loved could grow enough to understand that the daughter they'd dismissed as a beautiful, intelligent failure had actually been a visionary all along. And tomorrow, when the entertainment industry celebrated Phoenix Entertainment's acquisition by Netflix, they'd have to decide whether they wanted to be part of my story or just spectators to my success. The barbecue was over, but my real life was just beginning. The next morning arrived with the surreal quality of a dream bleeding into reality. I woke up in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by posters of movies I'd helped develop, and books written by directors who now took my calls. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of the entertainment my family consumed had been produced by the daughter they'd called a failure just 12 hours earlier. My phone had been buzzing since dawn with congratulatory messages from industry, colleagues, interview requests from major publications, and meeting invitations from competitors who'd suddenly discovered my existence. The Netflix acquisition had triggered a domino effect throughout Hollywood, with everyone scrambling to understand how they'd missed the rise of Phoenix entertainment. Downstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of Mom making breakfast, but there was something different in the rhythm of her movements, a hesitancy that suggested she was as uncertain about this new reality as I was. The kitchen that had been the site of countless lectures about my poor life choices was now the same space where she'd have to reconcile her disappointment with my undeniable success. When I finally ventured downstairs, I found the entire family already gathered around the dining room table, their faces showing the effects of a sleepless night spent processing revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and their own judgment. Dad looked up from his coffee with eyes that seemed to have aged years overnight. "Maya, we've been talking since you went to bed. We need to understand how we got this so wrong." The admission was painful to hear, because it revealed the depth of their confusion and regret. They weren't just wrong about my financial situation, they'd been wrong about my character, my capabilities, and my vision for nearly 5 years. "You got it wrong," I said gently, pouring myself coffee from the pot Mom had prepared, "because you measured my worth by standards that don't apply to what I was building." Carmen, who looked like she hadn't slept at all, was surrounded by printed articles about Phoenix entertainment that she'd apparently spent the night researching. "Maya, I've been reading about your company's impact on the industry. You've changed how streaming platforms approach international content development." The research she'd conducted revealed just how little they'd known about my actual work. While they'd been assuming I was struggling to find employment, I'd been revolutionizing content creation processes that affected millions of viewers worldwide. "There's something I need to tell you all," I continued, sitting down at the table where I'd eaten breakfast as a child, back when my biggest dreams involved becoming a veterinarian or an astronaut. "The success you're just discovering isn't new. Phoenix Entertainment has been profitable since its second year of operation." Uncle Roberto, who'd driven over early that morning to continue the conversation, set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "Maya, that means you've been successful for 3 years. 3 years while you staged interventions and offered me charity jobs," I finished for him. "While you worried about my mental health and questioned my judgment." The timeline was perhaps the most painful revelation of all. My success hadn't been a sudden windfall or lucky break. It had been a sustained achievement that they'd missed entirely because they'd been looking for failure instead of growth. Sophia, who'd been unusually quiet since her cruel comments the night before, finally spoke up. "Maya, I said terrible things about you to my friends. I told people you were the family embarrassment." Her confession hung in the air like smoke, revealing how far their disappointment had spread beyond our immediate family. I'd become a cautionary tale in their social circles, an example of what happened when children rejected their parents. Wisdom. "What's done is done," I said, though the knowledge that my reputation had been damaged in communities I might never have the chance to address was painful. But it reveals something important about how quickly we judge people whose paths we don't understand. Mom had been silent throughout the conversation, but I could see tears gathering in her eyes as she processed the full scope of what had transpired. "Mija, I called you a failure. I looked at my own daughter and called her a failure." The word still carried its sting, perhaps because it had come from her lips with such conviction. Parents were supposed to believe in their children's potential, not pronounce judgment on their worth based on incomplete information. "You called me what you saw," I replied, reaching across the table to touch her hand. "But you weren't seeing clearly because your vision was clouded by fear and expectations that didn't match my reality." My phone buzzed with another call from Sarah, and I could see from the preview text that the morning had brought even more opportunities. Good Morning America wants to book you for Thursday. Also, 3 major studios are requesting meetings this week. The momentum was accelerating, beyond anything I'd anticipated. The Netflix deal hadn't just validated my success, it had amplified it, creating opportunities that would have been impossible just days before. Daniel, who'd been so confident about my psychological problems, was reading something on his tablet that was clearly disturbing him. Maya, there's an article in the Denver Post about you. They're calling you Denver's secret entertainment mogul. It talks about how you built a global company while your family remained unaware of your success. The local coverage was inevitable, but it meant that their friends and neighbors would soon know the truth about the daughter they'd been discussing with pity and concern. The embarrassment they'd felt about my choices was about to be replaced by embarrassment about their judgment. Maya, Carmen said hesitantly, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. I nodded, curious about what question could be so difficult that it required a preamble. When I called your office yesterday, asking about job opportunities, were you laughing at me? The question revealed the depth of her humiliation and confusion. She was trying to understand whether I'd been secretly mocking their attempts to help me while simultaneously running a company that could offer the kind of opportunities they'd assumed I needed. I wasn't laughing, I said honestly. I was sad. You were calling my company to find me a job because you couldn't imagine that I might already have one worth keeping. The distinction seemed to hit her harder than mockery would have. Laughter implied superiority, but sadness suggested disappointment in their inability to see my potential. Uncle Miguel, who'd been the most vocal about my need for real work, was struggling with revelations that challenged his entire worldview. Maya, I keep thinking about all the times I lectured you about responsibility and hard work. Meanwhile, you were working harder than any of us. The irony was particularly sharp because they'd assumed my unconventional schedule meant laziness, rather than the kind of flexible arrangements that came with executive-level responsibility. While they'd been working 9-to-5 jobs, I'd been managing global operations across multiple time zones. Hard work looks different in different industries, I explained. What you saw as laziness was actually strategic thinking, relationship, building and creative development that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics. Aunt Teresa, who'd been relatively quiet since the previous evening's revelations, suddenly spoke up with surprising intensity. Maya, I need to tell you something. Last month I told my book club that you were a cautionary tale about the dangers of following your dreams. The confession was particularly painful because book clubs were exactly the kind of community spaces where reputations were built and destroyed through casual conversation. She'd used my life as a negative example for other women considering unconventional paths. What will you tell them now? I asked, genuinely curious about how she planned to revise a narrative she'd been promoting for years. I don't know, she admitted. How do you explain that everything you thought you knew about someone was completely wrong? The question extended far beyond our family situation. They were grappling with the broader implications of their misjudgment, wondering what other assumptions in their lives might be equally unfounded. Dad stood up and began pacing again, a habit that had emerged whenever he faced problems too complex for immediate solutions. Maya, I need you to help me understand something. If you could afford to live anywhere, why did you keep coming back here? Why did you subject yourself to our criticism and disappointment? The question struck at the heart of a decision I'd been questioning myself. Why had I continued to expose myself to their judgment when I could have simply disappeared into my success and never looked back? Because, I said slowly, working through the answer as I spoke, I kept hoping you'd see me clearly. I kept believing that eventually you'd recognize that the daughter you were disappointed in was actually the daughter you should have been proud of. The admission revealed more vulnerability than I'd intended, but it was the truth. Despite their criticism and lack of faith, I'd continued to seek their approval and recognition. "We should have been proud," Mom said firmly, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "We should have been proud from the beginning, even when we didn't understand what you were building." The sentiment was generous, but it raised questions about unconditional support versus informed approval. Could they have been proud of something they couldn't comprehend, or was understanding a prerequisite for genuine pride? My phone rang again, and this time I could see it was a call from my business partner, Alex Chen, who was handling the Law CI, Angela's side of our post-acquisition planning. I answered quickly, knowing that timing was crucial in managing the media attention we were receiving. "Maya, congratulations on the deal. The industry response has been incredible, but I'm calling because we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." I could hear the excitement in Alex's voice, but also the underlying tension that suggested opportunity mixed with urgency. "What kind of situation?" I asked, aware that my family was listening to every word with the fascination of people discovering a hidden world. "Apple just reached out. They want to discuss a potential partnership for their streaming service, but they want to meet today, and they're only willing to negotiate with you directly." Apple. The name carried weight even for my family, representing the kind of corporate giant that didn't waste time on unsuccessful ventures or unproven executives. "Today?" I repeated, checking my watch and calculating travel time to Los Angeles. "Their jet is standing by in Denver. They want to fly you out for a meeting this afternoon and have you back tonight." Private jets and same-day meetings with tech giants. This was a level of business operation that my family had only seen in movies. The casual mention of corporate aviation and executive schedules was perhaps more convincing than any financial statements could have been. "Maya," Carmen whispered, "Apple is sending a private jet for you?" The question revealed her continued struggle to reconcile the Maya she thought she knew with the Maya who was being courted by some of the world's most powerful companies. "Tell them I'll be there," I said into the phone, then looked around the table at my family's amazed faces. "I have to go to Los Angeles for a few hours." The announcement created a ripple of excitement and disbelief. 6 hours ago, they'd been offering me therapy to cure my delusions. Now they were watching me field calls from entertainment and technology giants who wanted my immediate attention. "Maya," Dad said slowly, "when you come back tonight, could we start over? Could we have the conversation we should have had 5 years ago?" The request was both simple and profound. He was asking for a chance to respond to my success with the support and pride he should have offered my dreams. "We can try," I said, standing up from the breakfast table where I'd eaten countless meals as the family disappointment. "But you need to understand that this isn't just about celebrating success that's already happened. It's about believing in potential before it's proven." The distinction was crucial because they were eager to embrace my achievements now that they were undeniable. But the real test would be whether they could learn to support vision and ambition even when the outcomes were uncertain. As I prepared to leave for the airport, I realized that this was more than just a business opportunity. This was a chance to show my family what their daughter had become, to demonstrate that the dreams they'd dismissed as fantasies were actually blueprints for extraordinary achievement. The girl who'd left Denver 5 years ago as a family disappointment was returning home that evening as an industry leader. But more importantly, she was returning as someone who'd learned that the most valuable validation comes not from proving others wrong, but from proving yourself right. And somewhere between the private jet and the corporate boardrooms, between the media interviews and the partnership negotiations, I was discovering that success wasn't just about building something extraordinary. It was about having the courage to pursue your vision even when the people you love most can't see where you're going. The best revenge against those who call you a failure isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right so completely that their judgment becomes irrelevant. The Apple corporate jet was everything I'd expected and more. sleek leather seats, crystal glasses, and Wi-Fi that allowed me to conduct 3 video conferences before we'd even reached cruising altitude. But what struck me most wasn't the luxury. It was the crew's treatment of me as someone whose time was genuinely valuable, whose presence justified the expense of private aviation. As Denver's skyline disappeared beneath the clouds, I found myself thinking about the breakfast table I'd left behind, where my family was presumably still processing the revelation that their failure daughter was important enough for one of the world's most valuable companies to send a private jet across 2 states. The meeting at Apple's Cupertino headquarters was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 5 years of building Phoenix Entertainment. I was ushered into a conference room where senior executives who typically dealt with established media giants were waiting to discuss partnership opportunities with the company I'd built from nothing. Sarah Thompson, Apple's head of content strategy, greeted me with the kind of respect I'd been craving from my own family for years. "Maya, we've been following Phoenix Entertainment's work for months. Your approach to international content development is exactly what we need for our global expansion." The meeting that followed was a masterclass in corporate validation. These weren't people trying to help me or fix me. They were professionals recognizing my expertise and seeking my collaboration. They spoke about Phoenix Entertainment's innovations as industry game changers, discussed my leadership as visionary, and treated my time as a precious commodity. "We're prepared to offer an exclusive content development deal worth $200 million over 3 years, Sarah announced midway through our discussion, "but only if you'll consider making Apple TV Plus your primary streaming partner for original international content." $200 million. The number echoed in my mind as I thought about my family's intervention the night before, their concerns about my financial stability, their offers to help me find real work. They'd been worried about my ability to support myself while companies were competing to invest hundreds of millions in my vision. During the flight back to Denver that evening, I received a call that would add yet another layer to the surreal transformation my life had undergone in less than 24 hours. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably familiar. "Maya, this is Jennifer Lawrence. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from our mutual agent." Jennifer Lawrence, the Academy Award-winning actress, was calling me directly on a Tuesday evening while I was flying home from a meeting that could reshape the entertainment industry. "I've been following your work with Phoenix Entertainment," she continued, "and I have a passion project I've been trying to get made for years. After reading about your approach to female-driven international content, I think you might be the only person who could make it happen." The conversation that followed was a producer's dream, a major star with a compelling story, unlimited creative freedom, and the backing of the most successful content company in the industry. By the time we landed in Denver, I had commitments that would keep Phoenix Entertainment busy for the next 5 years. But more than the business opportunities, what struck me was the respect in her voice. Jennifer Lawrence wasn't calling me as a favor or an act of charity. She was calling because my reputation in the industry had reached a level where A-list talent sought my involvement in their most important projects. The drive home from the airport gave me time to process not just the day's meetings, but the broader implications of what had happened to my family relationships. In 12 hours, I'd gone from being their greatest disappointment to being someone whose success they could barely comprehend. When I walked into the house, I found them exactly where I'd left them, gathered around the dining room table, but now surrounded by newspapers, magazines, and printed internet articles about Phoenix, entertainment, the Netflix acquisition, and my rapid rise in the entertainment industry. "Maya," Dad said, looking up from a copy of Variety that featured my photo on the cover, "we've been learning about your company all day. We had no idea that the entertainment industry was even watching what you were doing." The stack of publications told the story of their crash course in my professional life. They'd spent the day discovering that their struggling daughter was actually a recognized leader in an industry they'd dismissed as frivolous. Carmen held up her laptop, showing me a Forbes article titled, "The Quiet Revolutionary: How Maya." Rodriguez built an entertainment empire while her family thought she was failing. Maya, this article. It quotes industry executives calling you one of the most innovative content developers of your generation. Steven Spielberg mentions your work. Steven Spielberg. Even my family recognized that name, understood what it meant for one of Hollywood's most legendary directors to acknowledge my contributions to the industry. "There's more," Sophia said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "I found video interviews you've done with industry publications. You've been giving keynote speeches at conferences I've never heard of. You're famous in a world we didn't know existed." The revelation that I'd been building a public profile in professional circles while remaining invisible to my family highlighted the gulf between their understanding of success and the reality of my achievements. Mom approached me with tears in her eyes, carrying a printed email that she'd apparently been clutching all day. "Mija, I did something today that I need to tell you about." I waited, curious about what could have prompted such emotion. "I called Aunt Rosa, Uncle Pedro, all the cousins, everyone I've been complaining to about your choices for the past 5 years. I told them the truth about what you've accomplished." The admission revealed the scope of damage control she'd felt necessary. My reputation had been a casualty of their disappointment, spread through extended family networks and community circles, where I'd become synonymous with poor life choices. "How did they react?" I asked, genuinely curious about how our relatives would process the revelation that their cautionary tale had actually been a success story. "Shock," she said simply. "Complete shock. Uncle Pedro said he'd been telling his children not to follow your example. Aunt Rosa admitted she'd been using your story to warn her daughter against pursuing art school." The ripple effects of their misjudgment extended far beyond our immediate family. I'd become a negative influence in conversations I'd never participated in, a warning about the dangers of unconventional choices shared among relatives who barely knew me. Uncle Roberto, who'd returned that evening to continue processing the previous night's revelations, was holding a copy of The Hollywood Reporter with my interview on the cover. "Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, prepared for whatever question had been troubling him throughout the day. "In this interview, you talk about overcoming skepticism from people who couldn't envision success outside traditional frameworks. Were we the people who couldn't envision your success?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected from someone who'd spent years dismissing my ambitions. He was beginning to understand that their failure to see my potential hadn't been a minor oversight. It had been a fundamental inability to recognize innovation when it didn't conform to their expectations. "You weren't malicious," I said carefully. "But yes, you were skeptical in ways that made it harder for me to believe in myself." The admission hung in the air like a confession, because it revealed that their lack of faith had created obstacles beyond the external challenges of building a company from scratch. Daniel, who'd been quietly reading on his tablet, suddenly looked up with an expression of dawning horror. "Maya, I just realized something. Last Christmas, when you offered to pay for Kevin's college tuition, we assumed you were being irresponsible with credit cards or loans. The memory was particularly painful because it represented a moment when I'd tried to demonstrate my success through generosity, only to have my gesture interpreted as further evidence of poor financial judgment." "I remember that conversation," Kevin said quietly. "I actually wanted to accept your offer, but Mom and Dad convinced me it would be enabling your delusions." The revelation that my own brother had been interested in my support, only to be discouraged by parents who thought they were protecting him from my irresponsibility, added another layer to the tragedy of miscommunication that had defined our relationships. "Maya," Carmen said hesitantly, "I have a confession to make. After you offered to help with Kevin's tuition, I researched your financial situation. I was planning to stage an intervention about your spending habits." The irony was almost too perfect to bear. She'd been investigating my finances to prove I was financially irresponsible, while I'd been managing a company whose revenue exceeded most people's lifetime earnings. "What did your research reveal?" I asked, curious about how she'd misinterpreted the evidence. "Nothing," she admitted. "I couldn't find any information about your income, expenses, or financial obligations. It was like you existed in a financial vacuum." The absence of easily discoverable financial information should have suggested either sophisticated privacy management or legitimate business structures, but they'd interpreted it as evidence of financial chaos rather than professional discretion. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Disney just called. They want to schedule a meeting for tomorrow. Also, Amazon Prime is interested in discussing exclusive partnerships." The messages kept coming, each one representing opportunities. That would have been unimaginable just weeks before. The Netflix acquisition had legitimized Phoenix Entertainment in ways that opened doors throughout the industry. "Maya," Dad said, studying my expression as I read the messages. "These opportunities you're receiving, they're not just about money, are they? They're about recognition for something you've been building for years." The observation showed more insight than I'd expected. He was beginning to understand that my success represented more than financial achievement. It was validation for a vision that had sustained me through years of doubt and criticism. "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "These partnerships represent acknowledgement that the approach I've been developing actually works, that the risks I took were calculated rather than reckless." Aunt Teresa, who'd been silent throughout most of the evening's conversations, suddenly spoke up with surprising emotion. "Maya, I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything we discussed yesterday." I waited, unsure what revelation could be more significant than those we'd already covered. 6 months ago, my daughter Maria told me she wanted to leave her accounting job to pursue photography. I used you as an example of why she should stick with stability. I told her that following creative dreams was selfish and irresponsible. The confession hit harder than any of their personal criticisms had. They'd used my life as a cautionary tale to discourage other young people from pursuing unconventional paths, potentially stifling ambitions that might have led to extraordinary achievements. "What did Maria decide?" I asked, hoping their influence hadn't derailed another person's dreams. "She stayed with accounting," Aunt Teresa said quietly, "but she's been miserable ever since. She calls me crying about her job, asking why she feels so empty doing work that's supposed to provide security." The story of Maria's abandoned photography dreams represented all the potential casualties of their risk-averse philosophy. How many other young people had been discouraged from pursuing their visions because my family had used my life as evidence that unconventional choices led to failure? "It's not too late for Maria," I said firmly. "Phoenix Entertainment is always looking for talented photographers for our international projects. If she's serious about her art, I'd be happy to review her portfolio." The offer seemed to surprise them, perhaps because they hadn't expected me to respond to their years of criticism with opportunities for their children. "You would do that?" Aunt Teresa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've said about your choices?" "I would do that because I understand what it's like to have your dreams dismissed by people who should be supporting them," I replied. "And because talent deserves opportunities regardless of family politics." The gesture seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere, as if my willingness to extend professional opportunities despite their personal criticisms had demonstrated a level of maturity they hadn't expected. Carmen closed her laptop and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been genuine respect mixed with regret. "Maya, I need to ask you something else, and I hope you'll consider it seriously." I nodded, curious about what request could require such careful setup. "Would you consider hiring me? Not as charity or family obligation, but because I might actually be able to contribute something valuable to Phoenix Entertainment?" The question revealed both her professional ambition and her recognition that my company represented opportunities she couldn't find elsewhere. But it also raised complex questions about mixing family relationships with business partnerships. "What makes you think you'd be a good fit for entertainment industry work?" I asked, genuinely curious about her qualifications beyond real estate sales. "Because," she said, pulling out a folder I hadn't noticed before, "I've spent today researching your company's expansion strategy, and I think I understand something about your international development approach that other people might be missing." The folder contained detailed notes about Phoenix Entertainment's operations, market analysis that went far beyond casual research, and strategic observations that suggested genuine business insight. "I'm listening," I said, intrigued despite my reservations about working with family members. "Your international success comes from understanding local markets in ways that traditional Hollywood studios don't," she began, her real estate background evident in her analytical approach. "You're not just translating American content for global audiences. You're creating content that speaks to specific cultural experiences." The observation was more sophisticated than I'd expected, revealing that she'd been thinking strategically about my business model rather than simply trying to find a way to benefit from my success. As the evening progressed, I realized that the day's events had fundamentally changed not just how my family saw me, but how I saw them. They weren't just people who'd failed to recognize my potential. They were people capable of growth, learning, and genuine change when presented with undeniable evidence of their mistakes. The family that had called me a failure was slowly transforming into a family that might actually be able to support the success they'd never thought possible. But the real test would come not in their reaction to my achievements, but in their ability to believe in future dreams that hadn't yet been proven, visions that existed only in imagination and ambition. Because that's what family support really means. Not celebrating success after it's been validated by the world, but believing in potential when it exists only in the heart of someone brave enough to pursue the impossible. The morning after, my Apple meeting brought unexpected visitors to the Rodriguez household. I was barely finished with my coffee when the doorbell rang, followed by the sound of my mother's surprised voice greeting people I didn't recognize. Through the living room window, I could see a sleek black SUV parked in our driveway, the kind of vehicle that suggested official business or high-level corporate activity. "Maya," Mom called from the front door, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and excitement. "There are some people here to see you. They say they're from Netflix." Netflix executives, at my parents' house, on a Wednesday morning in suburban Denver. The surreal nature of my new reality hit me again as I walked to the door to find 3 impeccably dressed professionals standing on the front porch where I'd once waited for the school bus. "Ms. Rodriguez," the lead executive said, extending his hand with the kind of respect I'd been craving from my family for years. "I'm David Chen, VP of Global Content Strategy for Netflix. We apologize for the unannounced visit, but we wanted to discuss some urgent opportunities that couldn't wait for your return to Los Angeles." Behind David stood 2 other executives, a woman I recognized as Maria Santos, Netflix's head of international development, and a man introduced as James Park, their director of strategic partnerships. These were people whose decisions affected the entertainment choices of hundreds of millions of viewers worldwide, and they were standing in my childhood home requesting my immediate attention. "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the living room where my family had been reading more articles about Phoenix Entertainment's sudden prominence in the industry. "Please, come in." The sight of Netflix executives settling into the same furniture where my family had staged their intervention just 2 days earlier felt like a scene from a parallel universe. My parents hovered nervously in the background, clearly unsure whether to offer coffee or simply disappear entirely. "Maya," David began, opening a tablet that displayed financial projections and market analysis charts. "The response to yesterday's acquisition announcement has exceeded all our expectations. We're receiving inquiries from international markets we hadn't even considered entering." The charts he showed revealed the global impact of our partnership, increased subscriber interest in regions where Phoenix Entertainment's content had created anticipation for expanded international programming. Our work hadn't just been successful, it had opened markets that other companies had struggled to penetrate. More importantly, Maria added, we're seeing interest from talent and creators who want to work specifically with Phoenix Entertainment's development model. Your approach to international storytelling has created a brand within our brand. The recognition was gratifying, but what struck me most was the setting. 2 days ago, this living room had been the site of my family's certainty that I was failing. Now it was hosting strategic planning sessions for one of the world's most influential entertainment companies. Carmen, who had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway to eavesdrop, was frantically taking notes on her phone. The business education she'd been so proud of was finally encountering the kind of high-level strategy discussions she'd only read about in case studies. Ms. Rodriguez, James said, pulling out contracts that were clearly prepared for immediate signing. We'd like to discuss an accelerated expansion timeline. Instead of the 3-year development plan we originally outlined, we're prepared to compress that into 18 months with proportionally increased investment. The proposal represented a massive acceleration of our growth strategy, the kind of opportunity that could transform Phoenix Entertainment from a successful boutique operation into a major industry player almost overnight. The numbers we're discussing, David continued, would make this the largest content development partnership in Netflix's history. We're talking about a total investment approaching $1 billion over the next 2 years. $1 billion. The figure hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. My family, who had been concerned about my ability to pay rent, were witnessing negotiations for a partnership worth more than most small countries' entertainment budgets. Dad, who had been quietly observing from his position near the bookshelf, cleared his throat nervously. Excuse me, but did you say $1 billion? David turned toward him with the patient politeness of someone accustomed to explaining business concepts to civilians. That's correct, sir. Your daughter has built something truly exceptional. Phoenix Entertainment's approach to content development is revolutionizing how we think about global audiences. The validation from industry leaders was perhaps more convincing than any personal testimony I could have offered. These weren't family members trying to be supportive. These were professionals risking their careers and their company's resources on their assessment of my capabilities. There's something else, Maria said, addressing me directly while my family listened with obvious fascination. We'd like to discuss creating a Phoenix Entertainment production facility. Netflix is prepared to invest in a physical studio space that would serve as the hub for all our international content development. A studio. My own production facility, funded by Netflix, dedicated to the vision I'd been developing since leaving accounting 5 years earlier. The proposal represented not just financial investment, but institutional commitment to the approach my family had dismissed as impractical dreaming. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, but the area code suggested it was coming from Los Angeles. I answered quickly, knowing that timing was crucial in managing the cascade of opportunities that had followed the Netflix announcement. Maya Rodriguez? The voice was instantly recognizable. Ellen DeGeneres, whose production company had been responsible for some of the most successful daytime television in history. Ellen, I said, aware that my family's eyes had widened at the sound of her famous voice coming through my phone's speaker. Thank you for calling. Maya, I've been following your work for months, and I have a proposition that I think could change television. I want to develop a talk show format specifically for international audiences, and I need a producer who understands global markets the way you do. Ellen DeGeneres, wanting to work with me on a project that could reshape international television. The call was happening in my parents' living room, witnessed by Netflix executives who nodded approvingly at the recognition from another industry giant. I'm actually in a meeting with Netflix right now, I said, glancing at David, who was clearly intrigued by the potential collaboration. Would it be possible to discuss this partnership as part of a larger development strategy? Even better, Ellen replied. I was hoping this could be a Netflix original production. Let me know when you're ready to talk specifics. The convergence of opportunities was almost overwhelming. In the span of a single phone call, I'd gone from discussing a billion-dollar partnership to being courted by one of entertainment's most successful personalities for a project that could define the future of international television. Sophia, who had been silently observing from the staircase, descended into the living room with her laptop open to what appeared to be a live stream of entertainment industry news. Maya, you're trending on social media. Her Phoenix Rising is being used by people talking about following unconventional career paths. The hashtag revealed that my story had transcended industry news and become part of broader cultural conversations about success, failure, and the courage to pursue dreams despite family skepticism. Actually, James said, consulting his own phone, that social media attention is part of what's driving the accelerated timeline. Your personal story is resonating with audiences in ways that could significantly amplify the impact of our content partnerships. My personal story, the family intervention, the years of criticism, the revelation of hidden success, it had all become part of the Phoenix Entertainment brand, a narrative that made our content more compelling to audiences who saw themselves in the struggle between conventional expectations and unconventional dreams. David stood up, clearly prepared to conclude negotiations that had exceeded even his ambitious expectations. Maya, we need a decision on the expansion timeline today. The industry momentum won't wait for extended deliberation. The pressure was intense but not unwelcome. These were the kinds of decisions that defined career trajectories, moments when hesitation could mean missing opportunities that might never come again. Before I give you an answer, I said, looking around the room at my family's amazed faces, I need to address something with the people who are witnessing this conversation. I turned toward my parents, who had been standing frozen near the kitchen doorway since the Netflix executives arrived. Mom, Dad, 2 days ago you called me a failure and suggested I needed therapy to accept reality. What do you think about reality now? The question was perhaps unnecessarily dramatic, but I needed them to verbalize their recognition of how completely wrong their assessment had been. Mija, Mom said, her voice shaking with emotion. We didn't understand. We couldn't see what you were building because it was so far beyond anything we could imagine. Dad nodded slowly, his engineer's mind clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence with his previous assumptions. Maya, we measured your worth by standards that didn't apply to what you were creating. We were wrong about everything. The admission was painful to hear because it revealed not just their misjudgment, but the years of self-doubt their criticism had created. I'd spent countless nights wondering if they might be right, if my dreams were indeed impractical delusions that would lead to inevitable disappointment. Maya, Carmen said, stepping forward with the folder she'd been carrying since the previous evening. I've been thinking about your international expansion strategy all night, and I have some ideas that might be relevant to these discussions. She opened the folder to reveal detailed market analysis, demographic research, and strategic recommendations that went far beyond casual interest. She'd been studying Phoenix Entertainment's operations with the intensity of someone preparing for a job interview. Actually, Maria said, examining Carmen's research with obvious interest, these insights about Latin American market penetration are quite sophisticated. Have you worked in international business development before? The question revealed that Carmen's background in real estate, combined with her crash course in entertainment industry analysis, had produced insights that industry professionals found valuable. Carmen has been researching opportunities to contribute to Phoenix Entertainment's growth, I said, making a decision that surprised even me. If we're discussing expanded operations, we might want to consider bringing her onto the development team. The offer seemed to shock Carmen as much as it surprised me. Her research had been thorough enough to impress Netflix executives, and her motivation was clearly genuine rather than opportunistic. Uncle Roberto, who had arrived that morning to witness the Netflix meeting, raised his hand tentatively like a student seeking permission to speak. "Excuse me, but I have a question about the business model you're all discussing." David turned toward him with the same patient professionalism he'd shown my father. "Of course. What would you like to know?" I spent years telling Maya that creative industries were too risky for serious business investment. How wrong was I? The question was both personal and professional, revealing his struggle to understand how industries he'd dismissed as frivolous could generate the kind of financial returns that commanded respect from major corporations. "Sir," David replied, "the creative industries represent some of the fastest-growing segments of the global economy. Content creation, in particular, has become one of the most valuable commodities in international markets." The explanation was delivered with the authority of someone whose career was built on understanding entertainment economics, providing Uncle Roberto with expert validation that his previous assumptions had been not just wrong, but dramatically outdated. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from Sarah. "Warner Bros. Wants to schedule an emergency meeting. They're prepared to make a competitive offer to the Netflix deal." Warner Bros. The emergence of competition for Phoenix Entertainment's partnership represented validation that went beyond any single company's interest. Multiple major studios were now viewing my company as a strategic priority rather than an emerging opportunity. "David," I said, holding up my phone, "it appears we have competitive interests developing. How quickly do you need that decision?" His expression shifted to reflect the urgency of corporate competition. "Maya, if Warner Bros. Is making offers, we need to finalize our partnership today. This level of industry attention won't wait for extended negotiations." The pressure was exactly what I'd been training for during 5 years of building Phoenix Entertainment. High-stakes decisions with limited timeframes and significant consequences. But what made this moment special wasn't the business opportunity. It was the audience. My family was witnessing the culmination of everything they'd dismissed as impossible. The dreams they'd called unrealistic were generating competition between entertainment giants. The career path they'd considered irresponsible was being validated by some of the most successful companies in the world. "Maya," Mom said quietly, approaching me with tears in her eyes, "whatever you decide, we want you to know that we're proud of you. Not just because of the money or the recognition, but because you believed in yourself when we couldn't." The acknowledgement meant more than any business contract could, because it represented the family support I'd been seeking throughout my unconventional journey. As I prepared to make decisions that would shape Phoenix Entertainment's future and potentially influence the global entertainment industry, I realized that the most important victory wasn't the Netflix deal or the competitive offers. It was the transformation of my family from people who saw my dreams as problems to be solved into people who recognized my vision as achievements to be celebrated. The failure they'd tried to fix had become the success they'd never imagined possible. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt truly supported by the people whose opinion had always mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.